Okay, everyone, let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Toronto Metropolitan University Urban Innovation and Action session. I'm Dr. Pamela Robinson. I'm a professor at the School of Urban and Regional Planning. I'm also the interim director of City Building TMU, which is a research mobilization unit bringing city building research to the community at large. We're delighted to have you with us. We'll start today by acknowledging that we are in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land with subsequent Indigenous nations and people. Europeans and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. The land acknowledgement is particularly important today as we welcome colleagues from Urban Water TMU. As we all know, we have a tremendous freshwater crisis in First Nations communities across our country. And so the research that happens at our university and across other universities is an important part of contributions to trying to right that human rights wrong. Today, I'd like to let you know that we're going to be recording this session. We're excited to have this great team of interdisciplinary researchers with us, and we're going to talk about urban water challenges through transdisciplinary research and their work with external networks of people and collaborative action. Urban Water TMU comprises researchers and students from across 6 faculties at our university and 13 departments. Its experts work impactfully on a broad range of complex urban water issues, including urban water management, contaminants of emerging concern, natural systems and green technologies, and Indigenous community water issues. Today, we're going to focus on a subset of urban water issues that stem from urban impacts. And we're going to start by talking about wastewater and runoff, and then we're going to move on to problems with excess salt or salinization, and then we're going to talk about a few topics in between. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping details. The presentation today will start with some questions and answers that are moderated by me with our panelists for about 40 minutes, followed by about 15 minutes of question and answers. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A function where you can type in questions in advance. If you look at those questions and see one that you like, you can vote it up, and we'll draw in our interactive session from the questions posted there. Apologies in advance if we can't get to everyone's questions. So just remember, if you go to the bottom of the screen, you'll be able to see how to do that. As I said before, we're recording this session. You'll be able to find the recording on our City Building TMU website in the coming days. And if you make sure that you're subscribed to our newsletter, then you'll be kept up to date on this webinar and other ones that will follow, along with other emerging research from our university. Okay, now without further ado, here are our panelists. I'm so excited today to introduce Dr. Claire Oswald. Claire is an associate professor in our Department of Geography and Environmental Studies, and she's currently the academic director of Urban Water TMU. Claire's work is inherently interdisciplinary, and it can be broadly categorized as watershed hydrology and biogeochemistry. Her research group at our university has done impactful work on chloride pollution from road salting, the influence of stormwater ponds on hydrologic transit times and chlorine transport, and the environmental benefits of anti-icing on private properties. She's also co-leading a project on wastewater surveillance with the City of Toronto that provides complementary information to public health on the spread of COVID-19 virus. Next up is Barry Orr. Some of you may recognize Barry if you listen to CBC. Barry is the Sewer Outreach and Control Inspector for the City of London, Ontario, and he works with Urban Water TMU as the leader of what they call the Flushability Lab, which you're going to hear more about soon. He's got over 25 years of experience in environmental and wastewater fields, and he's an active member of a number of associations and a vocal advocate within the sector, advancing simple, practical solutions to protect our sewer system infrastructure and water environment. You can find him at Barry Orr with 2rs.ca. Next up, Stephanie Melles. Stephanie is an associate professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biology at our university and an expert in the field of spatial ecology. Stephanie's work tries to understand how we can maintain ecological resilience in an increasingly urban world, and she takes an interdisciplinary approach based on network science, geospatial analysis, and data science, combining lab, field, and species environmental monitoring data. She's known for her research studying the impacts of urbanization and climate change on bird species, as well as her involvement with the Great Lakes Ecological Observatory Network. And then our final panelist today is Dr. Darko Joksimovic. Darko is an associate professor of civil engineering with over 20 years of research and engineering practice experience. His work focuses on urban water systems and has involved a number of projects dealing with the development and application of monitoring, modeling, and decision support systems. He's collaboratively He's collaborated extensively with a number of people from the water industry, including municipal water managers, regulators and consultants, and other stakeholders. And collectively, they've worked on the challenges ranging from the performance of distributed living infrastructure and water collection systems operations to the planning of centralized water reuse systems. So as you can see, we've got an incredibly potent and impactful group of researchers, and I can't wait to uncork them and let them start talking about their work with you. So as we said before, we're going to talk amongst ourselves for about 35 to 40 minutes, and there's lots of time for questions at the end. So let's kick it off with a question for you, Barry. You're up first, okay? And we're really interested in hearing more about your expertise related to flushability. We know that you work deep in the Center of Urban Innovation on Gerrard Street. And what we're going to do, just to help people understand your work, is we're going to play a quick public service announcement related to your research. Claire?
Do you have the volume?
Claire, we can't hear the sound. Let's pause.
Claire, if you click the more button on your Zoom taskbar and go to share sound, that's just on the actual Zoom taskbar at the top. If you click on more, you should see share computer sound. If you check that on, and then you can replay it.
Barry, maybe you can tell us what was in the PSA.
Sure.
Awesome.
So the PSA was designed to communicate that there are flushable products that will disperse in the sewer system very quickly, and working with NICEPAC. That's what we were demonstrating there in the PSA, and so hopefully you can get it to work, and then you show very quickly.
We'll come back in a moment. So why don't you share with our audience the research that you're doing in your Flushability Lab? Tell us about what's up.
Sure. Let's start with a little history. So in 2010, the Municipal Enforcement Sewer Use Group, we had a meeting, and other municipalities were complaining about wipes being plugged in pumps and at pumping stations. So we looked into the fact that there was a label on these products called flushable. So just to show you, here's an example of one of these wipes. And we found they weren't dispersible. So we were like, well, why can they say they're flushable on the packaging when they're not falling apart? So we wanted to create a CSA standard. And we were trying to work with the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association and the manufacturers to get a standard in place. And we found we couldn't raise $150,000 here in Canada to create a standard. The manufacturers were going to keep bullying us along that these products were flushable, and I just couldn't have that because the science was not there. And so we developed the Flushability Lab to do scientific experiments around, do things disperse? What kind of fibers are in there? You know, all these kind of things we're doing in the TMU Flushability Lab.
Is it just my anecdotal impression, or have we seen a tremendous uptake in the use of wipes since the COVID-19 pandemic started? Are there more being used than ever?
Disinfectant wipes exponentially exploded being flushed down the sewer as soon as the pandemic happened. I'm sure Claire has found them collecting on the sample head for her. So they're a horrendous issue for us in the sewer system, and we need to communicate that the toilet's not a garbage can. Okay. And we need to create a standard around what can be labeled as flushable. So that's where our work is really coming into play at TMU, is that we're looking at dispersibility. You know, we're looking at flushable products. We're looking at toilet paper, right? You automatically assume that toilet paper is going to be fine. Well, our research has found actually that toilet paper does not break apart in your own toilet or in the private drain connection. It doesn't actually start to break apart till it hits the sewer main.
So Barry, what do you do? Like, how do you actually go about the process of changing hearts and minds? I mean, not everyone could put a bidet in their bathroom. So what are we going to do?
Education is key, but government regulation is where we really need to solve. And that's the frustrating part for myself and Darko, that we're not seeing our government listen to our research, listen to the science. Like, the manufacturers keep saying their products are flushable. Well, I have a product here that we tested. It's not falling apart in my hands. So then when you run it through the sewer system, it's like a lazy river ride. There's not a lot of force there. And so we've been taking results. We've been drying things out. We've been putting all this data together so that when the government would come to us and say, okay, you guys are the experts, please tell us what's going on, we'd be able to say, hey, listen, that flushable product, it only broke apart in 30 minutes at 4%. That's not acceptable, right? That's what we're doing, Pamela.
Okay, thank you. So next time everyone's at Great Wolf Lodge and they're on the lazy river, we can remind them to think like they're a wipe and they're not actually getting processed the way they are. Okay, Darko, I'm going to move to you next, but we're going to tackle wastewater from a different perspective. We know that your work focuses on green and living infrastructure. If we want our cities to perform better and ideally even optimally, we're going to have to start conserving our resources in lines with our ambitious climate emergency goals and developing better systems for dealing with and maximizing the use of rainfall and runoff. Can you tell us a little bit about the research that you're doing from an engineering perspective to help cities function better?
Thanks, Pamela. Well, the trend over the last couple of decades has been one of kind of decentralizing services, water and wastewater services, but also integrating the natural assets, or called blue-green assets, that with existing gray infrastructure, gray being the color of concrete, which is what we've been building for millennia. These are used to be called source controls. They still are, because they aim to control the water at the source rather than conveying it into the pipe and into other gray infrastructure. And this includes technologies like rain gardens, green roofs, permeable pavements, and so forth. And their uptake has really been more widespread in the last couple of decades. And in recognition that, sorry, that's my dog. In recognition that they provide multiple benefits. They don't just control the stormwater, right? They improve resiliency, they restore natural water balance, and so forth. Provide habitat, increase real estate values. There's a number of different benefits that they provide, which pipes in the ground don't necessarily accomplish. But at the same time, we've kind of have the need to better understand their performance, how they can be planned, implemented, operated, and so forth. So a lot of, in this respect, a lot of the bio-research has dealt with these kinds of challenges. And it ranges from using tools like remote sensing and geographic information system, integrating that with modeling, to identify the LID opportunities, which are typically site-specific, and also to facilitate developing detailed distributed urban drainage models that can capture their performance or simulate their performance on a small scale, right? These are very small installations relative to big pipes and tanks. We've also looked at cumulative potential of green infrastructure, for example, with Lake Simcoe, in a study where we said, well, what's the runoff and phosphorus reduction going to look like if we were to implement these watershed-wide? We looked at cost efficiency, obviously being engineers of different practices. This was a case study in London where there was a large need for infiltration to be preserved in a new development to protect what I was told was the last cold water fishery in the city of London. We also looked at basically laboratory and field monitoring of some of the novel technologies. So the one we just completed was a technology that's called a dome concrete forming system, which basically creates voids right under the pavement, concrete pavement, that can be used to store stormwater and infiltrate it. We've looked at some systems that are not so old, but that really required more research, like the Etobicoke exfiltration system, which introduces two perforated pipes beneath the storm sewer, and again promotes the infiltration of captured stormwater. And also another project in Etobicoke in Toronto that was called Sustainable Sidewalk, which was the first installation in the city, or if not the country, of the tree soil cells that provide the structural support for the sidewalk, but also filter and detain the stormwater that's running off the road surface. So a lot of interesting technologies, a lot of interesting studies.
So Darko, those are great examples of things happening kind of at the sidewalk level and below. Let's take everyone's perspective up to the roofs of our cities. Toronto's got over 700 green roofs. We actually have a green roof in an urban garden in our campus. What's your take on the performance of green roofs? People talk about their potential to make a difference. Are they utilizing water as efficiently as possible? And are we taking full advantage of the ways in which they can contribute to urban cooling and to hydrological cycle change?
Yeah, so the last I heard, there's upwards of 1,000 green roofs in Toronto by now, and this is going by building permits, and this, of course, is a result of the bylaw that the city introduced back in 2009, but also the Eco Roof Incentive Program for retrofits of existing buildings, and that program lists the many benefits that eco roofs provide, as you mentioned, hydrologic benefits, capturing stormwater, retaining, filtering, detaining. And this is particularly important in a city like Toronto and many others that have a combined sewer system, where the problems really begin when it starts to rain, as our systems become overloaded and overflow. Cooling and reduction of urban heat island effect is another benefit that you mentioned, but they also save building energy, ending in reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, since they provide better insulation to the buildings themselves. They improve air quality and so forth. Now, the green roofs have been around for quite a while, but newer technologies have started to emerge, such as blue roofs, which basically involve ponding the rain on the roof for slow release and or reuse within the building. And so-called blue-green roofs, which introduce an expanded storage layer beneath the green layer, again, for increased storage capacity and passive irrigation, for example. We did some studies to kind of look at these newer technologies and compare their performance to a more established green roofs. And we looked at the green roofs and blue roofs in a comparative study at a rooftop research facility at the University of Toronto. And results showed that better performance could be expected. But there are also some trade-offs. So, for example, the blue roofs show retention performance that is comparable to green, but the cooling effects are shifted to the evenings, where when they're less needed effectively. Blue-green roofs do provide better both retention and of stormwater and higher attenuation, but they may not offer the same building thermal performance benefits. We've also done work on the rooftop farm because rooftops are increasingly starting to be used as farms, and these operate very differently to the green roofs that are kind of plant and forget, more or less, maybe irrigate once in a while. And here we found that performance really varies. These are much more diverse type of installations. They're dynamic, so the plant selection, dynamics of plant growth and harvesting, right? We have this cycle showed a significant influence on performance. And more research is needed, and we're proceeding with this, primarily at the rooftop farm, including the use of low-cost sensors that could be used to continuously monitor existing and all the future green roofs and blue-green roofs.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, Claire, you're up next. I really want to move in, talk about your research related to wastewater surveillance. During the pandemic, it was exciting as your colleague to open up the paper and see your research team again in the paper and seeing your findings impacting public health practice on the ground. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing with the City of Toronto about what wastewater surveillance is and how easy or difficult it is for us to be monitoring wastewater related to COVID-19 virus proliferation and other public health concerns? And are there other applications of this research? So if you could walk us through that, that would be great.
Yeah, for sure. So thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it's been a really exciting project, the wastewater surveillance project. So this started back in the summer of 2020. And it's really a collaborative project amongst a bunch of different researchers at Water TMU. One of our colleagues had been doing wastewater surveillance for illicit drugs, so we were familiar with the approach. And we received internal funding from the university in summer 2020 to try and implement wastewater surveillance for COVID-19 in part of the city of Toronto. And we were successful with that, and the project has just grown since then. And actually, Stephanie and Darko were part of the project, and quite a number of other researchers, and especially need to shout out Dr. Kim Gilbride, who's the co-lead on the project. So I have a little slide just to share to explain to people what wastewater surveillance is. Hopefully everybody can see that. So basically, wastewater surveillance, you're collecting wastewater samples from the sanitary sewage network. So for example, at a wastewater treatment plant or through a maintenance hole cover somewhere in the sanitary drainage network, or even right at the outlet of individual facilities. We don't go right up to the toilet like the figure suggests. And then there's a whole bunch of work that happens in Kim Gilbride's lab. Basically what they're trying to do is extract genetic material from the solids in the sample, and to actually quantify the amount of genetic material of the SARS-CoV-2 virus there is in the sample. And then that information can be used for trend analysis, so to figure out if the disease is spreading in the community, if the prevalence is going up or if it's going down. And so we have, by about winter 2021, we got essentially seconded into a service role for the province of Ontario with this project. It started as a research project, turned into service. So we're part of the Ontario Wastewater Surveillance Initiative, and we're sampling at quite a few sites in the city of Toronto and reporting our results to Toronto Public Health, who use it for actions, public health actions.
Thank you. So before we move on and talk about your chlorine pollution from road salting, I just want to remind our audience participants that we're really happy to take their questions in the Q&A box, which we'll move into in about 10 minutes. So in addition to the work on wastewater surveillance, you've been doing research on the chemical implications of road salting. And you've had an opportunity to work with the city again. So another really good example of a university city hall partnership to look at their winter road salting practices. Can you tell us why road salt is such a big concern? It's particularly timely right now. We all still have snow on the ground in November.
Yes.
So why do we need to be concerned? And what kinds of recommendations can you share, both for individuals who are listening, but also institutionally and at a citywide scale?
Yeah, so we use road salt to maintain safe travel conditions. It melts snow and ice. The big problem is that when the snow and ice melt, the road salt dissolves and its constituents are, they move with the water into the environment. So one of those constituents is chloride. And the chloride, the sort of salty water that's running off our roads, is going to not only flow into the sewer system and get spit out into waterways, streams, rivers, lakes, but it can also make it into the ground and down into our groundwater. And when it gets down there, it kind of takes a slower pathway eventually to receiving waters. And the issue is that there's a lot of organisms that are not tolerant to large fluctuations in the amount of chloride that's in the water. And Stephanie will talk about that quite a bit. And so it's a problem. We've seen big changes in diversity and abundance of freshwater species in our urban waterways. And there's lots of things that can be done to mitigate this problem. The simplest thing is just to apply less of the rock salt that we see on the roads. We have a tendency, especially in Toronto and the GTA, to over apply. We're kind of addicted to road salt. It's like we want to see the pavement be bare of snow and ice, but we want to also see that layer of road salt on top, so we're really sure nobody's going to get sued, right, if there's a trip and fall. And so we can just apply less. Also liquids, so basically like a salty brine can be applied in advance of a forecasted snow event, and this helps the snow and ice to not bond to the paved surface, so it's easier to plow, and it ends up reducing the amount of salt that can be put down afterwards. A lot of municipalities are starting to use liquids more, and there are lots of other technologies that are available. It's just that people need to be incentivized to use them. So that's the big, I think, sort of policy hurdle is how do you do that?
If we could get people to salt their sidewalks less, then dogs like Darko wouldn't need to use wipes on their feet and they wouldn't end up in the
Yeah.
toilet, right?
Yeah, there we go. It's a big circular
circle
problem.
just moving around. Okay, Stephanie, you're up next. I want to move over and talk about concerns about salt from a different perspective. So your research focuses on salt and the salination of fresh water, and particularly in freshwater lakes. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work and particularly about what happens when we have salinization of fresh water? We know a little bit about zooplankton die-off and its impacts, but also what does it do to drinking water in Toronto and other cities?
Okay, thank you for having me, Pamela, on this panel. It's really nice to be here. To start with, I thought I'd just show a quick picture of to remind people what zooplankton looked like if you think back to your biology days. This is a picture of Daphnia, and you might remember them as water fleas, which I think is a misname of this species because they're responsible for foraging on all the algae that you have in the lake systems. So not just Daphnia, of course, but a whole suite of zooplankton are responsible for that. So Daphnia in particular, I think they're not bloodsuckers. They should be called, water angels or something like that, because they have such a pivotal role in our ecosystems. So I'm involved in a global ecological observatory network, and we were meeting and talking about how there's actually very little experimental evidence about what are the impacts of road salting on naive zooplankton communities. So by naive, I mean communities that haven't been exposed before. So what is the impact of road salt on these, freshwater communities that get, exposed just without ever having been exposed before? So yes, we devised an experiment, an in situ experiment. So rather than going into the lab, there's lots of lab studies showing how zooplankton die off with contaminants like salt. But we wanted to check what is it like in the lake or in a mesocosm. So we performed an experiment, and I'll share my screen again a second. So we performed, if I can forward past my Daphnia, an experiment in mesocosms at the lake edge, and we used a whole gradient in chloride levels, so just sodium chloride, straight salt. And we went from 0 or the background level, and in these lakes, there were about 3 to 4 milligrams per liter, all the way up to 1,500 milligrams per liter. And these experiments were done across the world at about 16 to 18 lakes. I can't remember the exact number. And here we have our phytoplankton at the bottom and zooplankton that eat the phytoplankton and keep those algae down. So things like Daphnia and other types of algae. Sorry, not Daphnia. The phytoplankton are things like diatoms, is what I meant to say. So what we found is really at 3/4 of these lakes, we saw big drops in zooplankton numbers. So 50% declines in abundances. And not only did we see declines in abundances, so this is a zooplankton community sitting in a lake. You can imagine this as a lake. And from the left to right, you have increasing salinity. So we saw declines in the abundance of zooplankton, which feed on the phytoplankton. So you saw an increase, we saw increases in phytoplankton on the right-hand side, a reduced zooplankton community, which then, feeds the base of the food chain, so feeds fish. And there's all kinds of questions here that still remain unanswered, like do zooplankton adapt to salinity? It's a basic driver in ecosystems. It changes osmotic balance, but zooplankton, like other things, can adapt. what is the spatial variability? What are the impacts of all other kinds of stressors? That's the pointed star of climate and transportation, agriculture, mining, and now I'm blanking on the other one, but we have a lot of stressors. So there's still some unanswered questions, but the findings from this global network have contributed to showing that our current guidelines are too lax, and that's around the world. Our guidelines around the world are too lax, and so we're seeing zooplankton die-offs by 50% across species at the levels in Canada, US, and Europe.
Stephanie, are you able to tell us, like, how are we doing in Toronto? Sorry, in terms of like trying to tackle this issue? Like, what's our practice like? What could we do more of? And how do our efforts relate to other, like, are there leaders worldwide that we should be looking to? Are people looking to us? Can you contextualize the role that our local government's playing here?
Sure. And I meant to answer your second part of the previous question about drinking water, which relates to this question to some degree. How are we doing here in the city of Toronto and at the shore of Lake Ontario? So, in Lake Ontario, we get our drinking water, from a long pipe out into the lake. And so we don't have the really heavy impacts of rivers and high chloride loadings that you see closer to the shore. That said, if you look at data from Lake Michigan, and Dr. Hilary Dugan out of the Center for Limnology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, she has looked at loading in Lake Michigan, and Lake Ontario receives water from Lake Michigan, of course. So from the 1800s to the present, you see an increase in fluoride from 1 to 2 milligrams per liter in Lake Michigan up to 15 milligrams per liter today. And that comes from 1 million metric tons of chloride loading into the lakes loading into Lake Michigan alone from rivers. And Claire has done the research in Lake Ontario, and I think that's on the verge of publishing soon. You can speak more to that, but we also have a huge number of metric tons going into Lake Ontario, and so that has an impact. And it's a large freshwater lake, with a lot of lake circulation, so it hasn't really impacted our drinking water now so much. But 15 times the levels of in the past, it must be having an impact. And if we keep going, within 100 years, our water will be undrinkable. So it's a huge issue, and we need to do more. And I think, the city of Toronto can take a leading role here and save money by reducing the salt application rates. So, they run train stations like Union Station is City of Toronto, even though we have the GO trains going through it. They can make changes, implement changes, and share the risk. So I think part of the reason we oversalt is because of this feeling like, oh, we don't want anybody to fall and sue us. But I think really we need to share the risk as individuals. As an individual Torontonian, I'm happy to take the risk of walking on a sidewalk that's not been salted or even not being shoveled, right? So I think it's important to realize there's an individual role here as well as government roles.
Well, and clearly from an accessibility point of view, the research that's happening inside research groups like Urban Water help us figure out alternatives to salting too, for when we need to keep pathways open and safe
Right.
and traversable for people who have mobility challenges. Those opportunities go hand in hand. Claire, do you want to add anything before I go to our last question, or shall I move on?
Yeah, no, I mean, you could talk endlessly about this issue of salinization of freshwaters. I mean, I think it's a bit of a dark horse, right? Like, it's getting increasing attention. There's a lot of research on it, but in terms of regulation and governance. I think it's a little bit stalled. There was actually a push in Ontario to provide liability protection to winter maintenance contractors so that they would be sort of more incentivized to apply a bit less salt, to adopt some of the best management practices like liquids that are out there. And they would get the liability protection if they could demonstrate that they had taken sort of like education and certification courses around the smart management of salt. But it got stalled. The province wasn't interested at this point in that. So, I think there's a lot that can be done. And like Stephanie said, it may seem like a small change in Lake Michigan, but you look up at Lake Simcoe, and Lake Simcoe's chloride concentrations are just going up. And it won't be long, like under probably 60 years before you'll be able to taste the salt in the water. So yeah, it's a problem.
So I just want to remind everyone who's here participating as a member of our audience that we'd really love to hear from you in terms of questions. I'm going to ask one more question to the panel, and then we'll go and see if anyone's got questions. I've got a question for you about being colleagues at Urban Water. You all have your own individual research labs. You're all from different departments. You've all got day jobs where you're teaching and working with students. What's it like being together under the umbrella of Urban Water? I know that, all of us have been working in a distributed way during the pandemic, but you have physical space too. What's it like for your research to be able to collaborate together under the big tent that is Urban Water, Toronto Metropolitan University?
I can go first. It's fantastic. It's great. I mean, so, if I have a question about urban infrastructure, especially if it's water related, I can go talk to Darko. If I have a question about ecology or stats, I go talk to Stephanie, right? And we're often in the same space because we now have this dedicated space on Gerrard Street. And so we bump into each other organically. Often our students are doing working in the same spaces, so then they also get to interact and learn from each other. And I think there's lots of examples of projects that have come out of the center that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So the wastewater surveillance is a perfect example where almost all of us are involved in it. I never would have done that on my own to take a lead on a project like that, but because the Urban Water Center was behind it and all these really smart people were behind it, it made it feasible.
Anybody else want to jump in?
I'll just add in a bit, Darko, because it's about Darko. Because, during COVID, we were trying to set up a sewer line, and Darko was able to get into the lab, and him and I worked intently at putting this sewer line together. So think about that, collaborating during a pandemic to make it happen. Right. So the group is just fabulous to be involved with, in my opinion. And I love to hear from the students. And when I see the students and I ask about their projects, then I get to learn from the students. And so for me, it's just a great opportunity. Thanks.
Great. Okay, we've got some questions from our audience, so I'm going to jump to them. The first one is, can prescription drugs be removed from sewage water? Claire's saying no.
Take that one.
Darko, yeah,
I'll shake my head, but I'll let Darko answer.
Yeah, I didn't shake my head, but the answer is the same.
Yeah.
No, the short answer is no, simply because we can't, we've been struggling to get a grip on the wipes, like the physical object that we're trying to get people not to flush down the toilet. The drug prescription medication is not just introduced by flushing it, it's secreted from our bodies. So this is definitely something that we cannot control.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of.
I should point out that these are obviously being looked at from the perspective of wastewater treatment plants and how effective they are at removing these substances that are inevitably going to be present in the sewage.
Claire, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say there's been some interesting research lately out of the States showing heavy loads of pharmaceuticals in urban rivers. And also just to mention that we do have some researchers that are kind of interested in this area of how wastewater treatment, can tackle this problem.
You know, it's interesting. When I was an urban planning student, one of the things we did was we got a tour of the wastewater treatment plant in Kingston, where I was a student. And it changed my behavior, because when they showed us how much gum was caught up in the grill in the sewage treatment plant, I no longer spit my gum out down the toilet. So if I can change my behavior, there's hope for everyone. But you think about wipes, you think about flushing other things down the toilet. Secreting pharmaceuticals is one thing, because that's a health and wellness thing. But I have some hope and faith that people's behavior can change. But maybe it starts with Doors Open Toronto and getting everyone to go on a tour of wastewater treatment plants.
Pamela,
Okay.
there's lots of other crazy things down in the sewers. It's
More
as I'm sure
interesting than
Barry's
my
aware
gum.
of.
Yeah. Yeah, true. How much Lego ends up down there? I know that's not what you're talking about, but okay. Next question is about the salinization of fresh water, and it's a two-parter. Regarding the concern over the metric of loading salt in Lake Ontario, who can we give this information to? How do we get this information into the hands of decision makers, and what can be done? And then also, are our wastewater treatment plants set up to remove the chlorine from the water before we drink it?
So I think that the province is aware of the loading of chloride to the lakes, and they do monitoring of chloride levels in Lake Ontario, and certainly at the drinking water plants they would be monitoring that. So I think people are aware of it. I think there are estimates out there on the loading to the lake, and certainly there's a lot of work looking at increasing chloride concentration trends in waterways and water bodies around the province. What was the second part of the question?
Can it be removed?
Oh, so I mean, you can desalinize water, but no, it's going into the environment. It's not being removed.
Okay, so I'm going to add a comment before we move on to the next question. One of our participants says we, meaning the city of Vaughan, recently added and amended a chloride parameter discharge limit for both the sanitary and the stormwater sewer in the city of Vaughan, and it's under it's the sewer use bylaw Schedule A, if anyone wants to look that up. So thank you, Jordan Bulk, for sharing that with us. Okay, next question. This relates to road salt and to sidewalk salt. Is liquid brine the lesser of the two evils compared to traditional road salt application?
Well, liquid brine still contains chloride, but it has a lot less in it than just the dry rock salt. But there aren't many circumstances where you would use liquid brine by itself. It's used, you put it down before a forecasted event. And then the idea is you don't need to put down as much dry salt afterwards, but you still need to put some down, typically. So, yeah, so it's sort of a different thing. It's used in a different way than the dry salt. So you would use the two in combination.
Are there any municipalities that you can point to who've comprehensively gotten their heads around how to both manage ecological responsibility and stewardship with the liability and the walkability parts of keeping sidewalks and other parts of the city safe and traversable over the winter? Like, is there a gold standard on this one?
You know, I'd actually point to Wisconsin. So not in Canada, sorry, but Wisconsin's really very active on the mitigating road salt front. And, you know, I think they do have a lot of freshwater science activities in that state as well. We've done like a jurisdictional analysis of various cities in Southern Ontario and included some American cities as well. And I think, you know, there's lots of examples of municipalities trying to implement some best practices to balance out maintaining safe travel conditions, but also reducing that input to the environment. But you don't see chloride trends going down. In fact, you often don't see, you know, if road salt usage numbers are published, you often don't see those consistently downward trend. So I think there are still a lot of barriers to a lot of places. And I think the liability issue is a huge one. It's real. Like, municipalities get sued when there's a car accident or there's slips and falls. And I think too, I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, but I don't even think it's at the municipal level that it's the biggest problem. It's on private properties. That's completely unregulated, right? At least for municipalities or for organizations that apply more than 500 tons of road salt per year. They fall under the Federal Code of Practice for the Management of Road Salt, where there are recommendations on how to reduce it. But private organizations, so think of your like big box store parking lots, there's nothing, right? So they don't want to get sued. They apply a lot of salt. There's like often very little incentive to try and reduce salt. So yeah, again, just like there's a lot we can still do to mitigate this problem.
So while we're on this theme of trying to impact change, Barry, let's ask you about wipes. Like what's the gold standard or what's the best practice on shifting practice around wipes? How can we get the message out better that wipes aren't flushable to consumers so that people can change their behavior, but also what other kinds of system change do you think we can get in place sooner rather than later?
The biggest thing is that government regulation is needed. And for some reason, the industry keeps pushing, well, let's not talk about flushable, let's talk about do not flush. And it's confusing if you don't identify what is flushable first. So, you know, two products that I'm working with, the Nice Pack, and we're working with the Kimberly-Clark, they are flushable. They're meeting the wastewater criteria. For dispersibility, yes, it's a celebration that we have manufacturers listening to us. And so we need to keep working that angle. That's why we did the PSA with Nice Pack. And 1st of December, we're going to do a PSA with Kimberly-Clark in the lab. So that will help get the message out. But unfortunately, we only have 1 or 2 products that really are flushable. So now, how are we going to get to all of those other falsely labeled products? The only way that we can do it is government. The government has to come in and step in here and listen to what Darko and I are saying around this dispersibility. You know, the science is there. These things are not falling apart. Okay, there's plastic fibers, there's regenerated cellulose fibers, and there's paper fibers. So anyways, that's my soapbox that I'm on here right now. So.
Darko, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think what Barry said is that, you know, the flushable wipes can be made, and the pressure needs to be put on all the manufacturers. And this is quite challenging because we live in a global economy where these products are coming from all over the world. But that's kind of one angle that we need to pursue, is to make manufacturers actually change their recipes and put products on the shelves that indeed are safe for sewer systems. Now, this is not going to happen quickly, being realistic. So other things we're looking at is also kind of being able to better track where these things are coming from in the sewer system, because sewer systems are hundreds or thousands of kilometers long. Once you realize that the problem is there, you realize typically at the end of the pipe. But so targeting the education, public education, to really problematic areas is something that we could do in the kind of short to medium term. Yeah, so those would be my suggestions.
So one of the themes that's run through most of your comments that we haven't actually said out loud is that we're trying to move away from end of pipe solutions to front end or behavior change solutions, so we don't have the problem to begin with. So one of our attendees has a question for you, and this is a very different kind of repositioning suggestion. When might urine and feces be recycled, and I hesitate to say harvested, before they're flushed with potable water through the sewers for sewage treatment as waste? Anyone want to jump in on that?
I could start. One of my big pet peeves is, why do we flush these with potable water? It's just how we've been doing things for hundreds of years. Yes, there are initiatives. Obviously, we've gone from kind of treating both stormwater and wastewater as a nuisance, and kind of getting it away as quickly as possible, to realizing that this is dirty, particularly with stormwater. This is a relatively recent discovery in the decades, right? To now be realizing that we need to embrace circular economy and treat all this as a resource. So there are a lot of initiatives. I would say in Europe, they've been a lot more proactive, and typically it's in the areas that lack access to drinking water sources. that are much more efficient. I mean, places like Israel, where they recycle over 90% of their wastewater effluent, and Singapore, and there are very good examples around the world, but typically in places where water is scarce.
Okay, I'm going to ask everyone to weigh in on this one before we move into my last question for Claire about the research center. We're heading into the holiday season, and sometimes people make a wish list or an aspirational list about things that they think they'd like to happen, whether it's in terms of asking for gifts or changes or asking for New Year's resolutions. So I'm going to ask each one of you in response to one of our participants' questions. What do you think is something important or some of the best solutions that could be implemented to affect both stormwater management and improving water quality? And maybe we'll start with Stephanie.
So what would be the best solutions to
Yeah,
implement?
if you had a wish, like you could see something implemented that you think would make a difference, what would it be? Either related to stormwater or freshwater quality?
Well, a 50% reduction in the application rates in road salting. I think at least that could happen without any impact on current safety levels, roads and private properties. Yeah.
Barry.
I wish that people would understand that a storm drain goes directly to creeks, rivers without any treatment, and that they would then respect it even greater, knowing that it's not going to a treatment facility. You know, it's going directly to our drinking water sources. And I would never wash my car again on the road, knowing that I would be drinking the aftermath.
Okay, this is two really good specific things. Claire and then Darko.
Yeah, I mean, I think building on both things, I would wish for education programs. Like, let's have modules or like entire lessons in elementary schools and in high schools to teach kids about water, like, you know, especially in built up areas where it can be heavily impacted. I think if you don't understand our water system, if you don't understand where water goes after it runs off our roads, if you don't understand where your toilet water goes and how it's treated, then how can you start to realize that there's a problem and then what the solutions are? So education for youth on urban water cycle.
Beyond that really boring static diagram of the water cycle on the handout, right? Like a more dynamic, interactive piece. Great. Darko, last wish to you.
That water cycle has recently been updated, actually, to include the standard one that's been using in classes over and over again has finally been updated to show urban areas. The natural water cycle does not exist anymore. So that's a bit of good news, I suppose. I think, you know, this managing stormwater at the source is something that we really need to embrace. And Claire mentioned, you know, educating youth. I would add to that educating stormwater professionals. This is relatively recent development. There aren't, you know, and we kind of work in this effort on educating new stormwater professionals entering into the industry. But industry is large, and there's a lot of resistance, and there are a lot of real concerns, particularly with regards to ongoing operation and maintenance. So engaging residents, again, more education. Everybody likes to have a nice, you know, garden in front of their house rather than having a curb and gutter. I mean, it's just visually more appealing. And then if you realize what other benefits this brings about, well, you may be inclined to go and pull a couple of weeds every once in a while. These are the kinds of efforts that we need to have a widespread implementation of these practices.
Okay, I'm going to put a shameless pitch in for all of our undergrad programs at TMU. So across the people on our panel today, we've got the Department of Geography and Urban Sustainability. We've got chemistry, and Darko, you're from civil engineering, right? And I'm from urban planning. So if you're an audience participant and you've got a young person looking for a career that's impactful, the ways in which people can get involved in terms of this kind of environmental change cover social science and engineering. We'd be very delighted to see your young learners at our institution. Okay, Claire, last question to you as we wrap this up. If, you know, when we listen to all of you talk about your research, one of the constant themes is that all of your research you share today includes partnerships. It includes partnerships with trying to change actions in the private sector with Barry's work. Claire, you and Stephanie and Darko all talked about work you're doing with municipal government. Barry actually has a job in municipal government. If people who are listening today are interested in exploring research partnerships with urban water, what should they do next?
Yeah, absolutely. They should reach out to us. So you can first go to our website. You can learn more about what we do and who our different members are and what their expertise are. There's contact information there. We have an excellent director, Angela Murphy, who is wonderful with our partners and really excels at nurturing relationships with partners. And yeah, we have a process in place to begin discussions with partners on potential projects to understand what challenges and questions they're interested in and how that is synergistic with what we do. And we have a track record of really excellent projects that involve partners. It's just something we do at the center. It's something we do at TMU. We don't just do fundamental research, we do applied research as well.
And sometimes these projects start small, right? Like sometimes
Oh,
the
yeah.
research projects are pilot and it's a one-off.
Oh, absolutely.
It starts and grows. And so if you're a listening person who has a research partnership to propose, I'll just add one to what Claire has said about the way in which our university engages with community-based research partners. We're quite committed to taking the research out of the university and making change on the ground happen. And in a time of a climate emergency, in a time of a freshwater drinking crisis, in a time of municipal infrastructure deficit, the work of urban water can really make a difference. So we'd love to hear from you if we could. Okay, we're at time. I want to thank all of our participants for coming. Thanks so much for taking an hour out of your day and spending time with us. I also want to thank our panelists today. The four of you, I think, did a phenomenal job of talking about an incredible breadth of research, both individually and collectively, that takes place at Toronto Urban Water. And finally, I'll just say, if you found this interesting, I hope that you'll come back and join us on November the 30th, where we're going to have a discussion with colleagues from the Center for Urban Energy, which is another research unit inside TMU, also at the Center for Urban Innovation on Gerrard Street. Dr. Fernandez and Dr. Quagga will talk about the research that they're doing related to urban energy. So thank you everyone today for coming. I hope you'll remember not to flush the wipes. I hope you'll think twice before you oversalt the sidewalk. And you'll remember to look up and think about the potential that green roofs offer in terms of the water cycle management in our city. Take care, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you so much, Pamela. That's
Thank
great.
you.
Nice.